We have some major new developments in the scandal around Cabinet Minister Bridget McKenzie. My colleague, Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell, has spoken to a whistleblower with key details on the program and how it was overseen. Andrew, great to see you. First of all, let's go straight to the heart of this. You've got some explosive revelations in the McKenzie-Rorts scandal. You've spoken to a former staff member and apparently there were alarm bells ringing internally well before this all exploded publicly.
Yes, so I've spoken to a former member of Bridget McKenzie's staff who has told me that in late 2018 they went to see Bridget McKenzie's then Chief of Staff to warn about major concerns this staffer had with the way the program was being administered and the fact that a scandal could occur out of it, that the minister was exposed by the methodology with which the grants were being handed out. I'm also told by this former staffer that they were not the only person to raise these concerns with the minister's Chief of Staff, but the minister's Chief of Staff replied to the staffer, "We have to do what the minister wants." That was the response, Kieran.
And you've got some detail as well about this suggestion that there was some reverse pork barrelling, Andrew, but this, according to the individual that you spoke to, was nothing other than an attempt to cover themselves.
That's right, Kieran. So essentially the phrase used to me by this former staffer is that Labor were given grants in this program to cover our arses. Essentially, Bridget McKenzie's made a point of the fact that the departmental recommendations were for 24% of Labor electorates, and it ended up being 36% of the grants went to Labor electorates. But it's been put to me that it was after the warning from this staffer and other staffers to the then Chief of Staff that that profile was lifted in an attempt to make it appear like the grants program was being administered in an appropriate way. Let's hear what Bridget McKenzie said about reverse pork barrelling the other week.
Well, if anything, Tim, there's a case of reverse pork barrelling going on. So if you look at the intervention that my decisions as Minister made to the projects that were actually delivered on, originally there was something like 26% of those projects recommended were heading into Labor Party electorates. The reality is, thanks to my decision-making as Minister, 34% of the projects delivered went into Labor Party electorates.
And Kieran, of those seats, of those Labor seats where the profile was lifted and more was given to Labor seats than was going to happen, they were primarily, the staffer says, targeted seats. Seats like Braddon in Tasmania and Solomon in the Northern Territory, the coalition thought they had chances of winning. But you can see the minister enthusiastically using that line there as a cover. It's been put to me by this former staffer that's exactly why that decision was made.
And the audit report suggested itself very clearly that it was a program targeting political aspiration in those seats, but you've got some information on just how brazen this was carried out in terms of the way the minister directed the funding to be delivered, basically.
Kieran, this former staffer has told me there are occasions Ms McKenzie would go away for a trip and she would come back into the office and say, "We should organise a grant for this electorate." It's been put to me that what happened then was staff were told to find a grant in the electorate and run it through the Sport Australia process. One particular example given to me is occurred after a trip to the Northern Territory to see the Liberal candidate for Solomon, Cathy Ganley, and after this the office was ordered to go and find some Northern Territory grants. They were duly announced. Northern Territory ended up getting about $2.8 million worth of funding. One of those grants was $500,000 to a shooting club that Bridget McKenzie announced about a month before the election.
So went to visit the seat, came back and said, OK, let's find some funds for this electorate. It's extraordinary. And then the Prime Minister's office. Now, talk us through this, because there have been various suggestions that some of the Prime Minister's own staff were involved. What's the information you've got on that? How deep was that involvement?
The former staffer I've spoken to, it has to be said, is underplaying the involvement of the Prime Minister's office. What I've been told is that there were two advisors in Ms McKenzie's office in charge of this program. They had a large spreadsheet, colour-coded spreadsheet with Labor seats, marginal seats, targeted seats, and it was Richard Hyatt and Beck Johnson. There was a staffer from the Prime Minister's office who's kind of nicknamed around the place the Nats Whisperer, Chris Daffy, who would go in and liaise with Ms McKenzie's office. But he was more, as it's been put to me, just making representations, saying these Liberal MPs are lobbying for this grant or that grant. He wasn't directing the program as such. That was very much the minister and her staff, is how it's been put to me by this former staffer.
And we have an example, Andrew, of the misuse of taxpayers' money. And if you don't laugh at what a joke this is, you'll probably cry. It's just unbelievable, this particular expenditure. I think it was about $160,000 we're talking about.
$160,000. Bridget McKenzie went to the Department of Health and successfully requested or successfully pushed through and announced at the Sporting Shooters Association of WA conference in late 2018 to examine the economic and social effects of shooting, to examine what positive impact shooting, which we all know she's a big shooting fan, can have on your health. And it's been put to me that this report was lobbied for by people in the shooting industry, announced at the Sporting Shooters Association conference, and the findings for a $160,000 report, well, they're not much to look at. Look at this. It says, listen to this, Kieran. It says, hunting and shooting provides opportunities for physical activity. Well, blow me down. As well as pathways for greater well-being through nature connection, self-efficacy, social networks, physical activity and nutrition. The survey results show that hunters and shooters have higher physical activity than the general population and higher levels of well-being than the general population. But here we go with the big disclaimer after you've spent 160 grand of our money. It says, however, it's not possible to say from the data whether hunters and shooters have these attributes because they engage in hunting and shooting or for another reason. That is, whether the observed attributes are a result of correlation or causation.
It's absolutely unbelievable. $160,000 to come up with a conclusion that's basically saying zero. Now, tell me, we know that the Prime Minister is going to address the Press Club on Wednesday. It's going to try and set the scene for his year. Surely he will not want this hanging over his head at that point. What's the timeline that you're hearing? Because there was a suggestion that the Gations report would be delivered at the weekend, that potentially would be the final nail in the coffin. We haven't heard if that's been delivered yet. What do you know on that front?
Well, my information now is the Gations report might not be acted on until Thursday, that he might go to his Press Club address, do that address, even though he risks a whole bunch of Bridget McKenzie questions, and then deal with the matter on Thursday. There's several reasons for that, one of which is Bridget McKenzie was given a deadline, as I understand it, of Friday afternoon, Friday evening, to come up with her responses to what had been found in the Gations report, her defence, if you like, and her office provided that information with a few minutes to go before deadline. So Phil Gations has had to go away with that and work with that as well. That's obviously taken a bit of time. As of this morning, it was my understanding the Prime Minister didn't have the report. Now, I would still tip that Bridget McKenzie is going to go. The Prime Minister made it known to people he's disquiet with the minister, but and there's a marginal chance it could happen later today even or tomorrow, but it was indicated to me that it was possible that it could happen Thursday. Now, Kieran, there's another thing I should mention regarding the revelations we had earlier. We did get a response from the minister to this. If we have that, we've got the minister does not comment on purported conversations between staff in her office, neither currently or in the past. That's to the accusation that there were warnings that went to her staff that they were going to get in trouble because of this scheme. Secondly, she says, in relation to the accusation, she came into the office and told her staff to go and find a grant for a particular electorate or area after a trip. She says, under the guidelines, the minister had discretion to choose proposals from the eligible list provided by Sport Australia. All projects selected were eligible for funding. And in relation to this, the health of shooters study, She says support to promote the socio-economic health and environmental benefits of hunting and shooting has been National's policy in the lead up to both the 2013-2016 elections. The study, which was initiated in the previous portfolio, found a $2.4 billion benefit from the sport to the Australian economy, and there were significant socio-health and other benefits for the 100,000 people involved in the sport each week. Well, that's good news. Thanks for that, Minister.
Yeah, indeed. Well, basically that statement denies nothing in what you've reported, and if she wasn't already gone, this clearly will go down terribly with the Prime Minister and other senior ministers. The fact that alarm bells were ringing internally well before this was made public. People internally knew this stank.
Yes.
They made it clear to the powers that be that this stank, but it continued on unabated.
People I've spoken to just can't believe the looseness, if you like, of how this was administered. They've got themselves in a position, her and her office, that you've got email traffic talking about targeted and marginal seats, about a taxpayer-funded sports grants program. She was really exposed out of this, and the Prime Minister, you know, has to be angry about that. That's certainly the case. So, I mean, apart from anything else, if you look forward in this, and if she were to somehow survive, which I don't believe will happen, I'm pretty sure in the Senate next week you'll have the setting up of a Senate inquiry. Now, there'll be the ability there, Kieran, to call current and former advisors of Bridget McKenzie, and she does have a lot of former advisors, I've discovered. So there's an ability for them to give highly embarrassing testimony to the Senate about the workings of that office.
Yeah, indeed. And I would have thought, Andrew, that as the Prime Minister tries to regroup and set his agenda for 2020 on Wednesday at the Press Club, it's a pretty important speech. He needs to get things back on track. He wouldn't want this major distraction. He's got many things to be dealing with. And I guess, as I say, he doesn't want this diverting attention from where he wants the focus to be, and that has been a very substantial, albeit many say belated, response to the fires.
Well, yes. I mean, logic would tell you the Prime Minister would attempt to get the Minister to resign prior to his Wednesday speech, but there hasn't been a lot of logic in the handling of this affair, Kieran, because it's dragged on for far too long. Given that we assume they're going to that outcome of Gaetjens finding against her and her having to go, but of course a lot of that is the relationship between the Liberals and the Nationals, and Michael McCormack, I suspect, not wanting to demand her head. So that's had to be dealt with through this inquiry process, but it just means the affair's gone for days and days. In terms of the Press Club speech, well, I understand the Prime Minister will be foreshadowing a range of initiatives in terms of the year ahead. He's already spoken about skills and things he needs to do in that area. He wants to set a direction. He doesn't want it overshadowed by a bunch of television news stories about the Bridget McKenzie saga, which if he doesn't get rid of her by then, it probably will. He'll also talk about climate change, but it won't be a major item. There'll be a collection of items. And he'll be sticking to the climate change target that Australia has. And I think to the line that if we can do better than using our carryover credits, if we can meet the target without using those carryover credits, we will. I think he'll really be pushing that to show people that he is acting on climate change.
Thanks, Andrew.